Game is going to be this holiday season? It's the new Nintendo 64. So what's the big deal, and why is Toys R Us already sold out? We have the answers.
The Nintendo 64, released in late September in 1996, and in Japan on June 23rd of the same year. It single-handedly revolutionized gaming as we know it today. Before the 64, the majority of games that were out looked like this. That is, until the 64 rolled around and turned games like that into games like this. A wide variety of titles released on the 64 are now well regarded as some of the best games of all time, and rightly so. Big hitters like Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and Star Fox 64. Games that already had a great standing with fans, and all who showed a massive improvement when released on the 64. But today, we're going to be talking about one of the system's lesser-known gems, South Park 64. But does it shine as brightly as the system's other aforementioned titles? Or does it belong a lost and forgotten title? Find out on today's episode of Behind the Thing.
So come on down to South Park and meet some friends, man.
South Park. South Park is an adult-themed animated show that premiered in North America on August 13th, 1997, on a small, unknown, at least at the time, channel known as Comedy Central. If you've been under a rock for the past 22 years, South Park mainly centers around a group of 4 young friends, Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Eric Cartman, as they deal with all the strange happenings and people in their small mountain town of South Park, Colorado. The show quickly became popular and gained a large fan base rather quickly and basically put Comedy Central on the map, making the channel the powerhouse that we all love today. The show is mostly famous for its no-holds-barred vulgarity and its extremely blunt way of expressing its views on some of the world's most controversial and most talked about current events. Another thing that sets the show apart, at least during its initial release, was its purposely poor animation style. While most shows were using cutting-edge CGI or even hand-drawn animation, South Park was animated by hand using mostly stop animation and paper cutouts for most of the scene's content. Despite all of its controversy and purposely poor animation, the show would go on to win over 5 Emmys and several other prestigious awards, and still remains a force to be reckoned with this day. Now, as with most things that end up becoming popular, in comes the merchandise. During its first year or so, it was mostly just t-shirts with the popular characters and their catchphrases, but then, barely a year after the show's initial release, South Park would see a video game released on the Nintendo 64 with the same title. South Park 64 would move on to be ported to the PC and PlayStation 1, but we're not going to talk about that today. So, did South Park 64 hold up to the show? Was it as popular as its namesake? But perhaps the biggest question that I at least at the time had was, how the hell do you make a game out of a show like South Park? Let's find out.
South Park, the fractured but homed.
Before we had the masterpieces we all know and love as The Stick of Truth and The Fractured But Whole, there were several other South Park games that were not so good. There was South Park Rally, which was a very poorly made and received kart racer published by Acclaim in 1999 on the PlayStation 1. There was also Chef's Love Shack, which was also released by Acclaim, and it was basically Mario Party, but with South Park characters. And I know it does sound like a great concept and all, but trust me, just forget about it. Then there was South Park 64, released on December 12th in 1998 in North America. It was developed by Iguana Entertainment and published by Acclaim. Wait, no. Don't go. I know. Just hear me out really quick, please. The game ran on the same engine that the studio had developed for Turok 2. Yep, that Turok. The gameplay of South Park played out like your typical FPS. Now, with GoldenEye, we had a decent control scheme for a system with one stick, but South Park was a little different. The game's C button moved your character in any given direction, and the stick would turn your character left and right and move the view up and down, which, when said out loud, sounds like a very difficult concept, but it actually wasn't that bad to use once you actually got it down.
From the deep reaches of space, a horror approaches. Once in a great while, the malevolent forces of a universe combine to form a force of evil so concentrated, so pure, that no bastion of goodness and decency can stand against it. It hurls through the universe toward its destination, the planet Earth. The town to be victimized, South Park, Colorado. A quaint little...
South Park's 64 story actually wasn't that bad, and even felt like it could have been an episode in one of the show's earlier seasons. A comet is slowly approaching South Park, and its appearance starts to cause some pretty strange things to happen. For example, in the game's opening level, the town is beset on by a large group of mutant, rabid, man-eating turkeys. Yep, evil turkeys. Only South Park, am I right? Anyway, most of the levels would have you rescuing or reuniting with your friends, who could then be equipped with their own weapons and switched in between on the fly. In between this, you would deal with several waves of enemies and very few tank enemies who would have to be killed in order to progress through each level. It could be a bit repetitive at times, but in my opinion, the gameplay was pretty solid. It had a variety of really fun weapons, which we'll soon get into, don't you worry. And that little South Park flavor that they mixed into it really helped spice up the game as well. The game could be completed in around 3 or more hours depending on how easily you could get through it. But a game based on South Park couldn't just get away with passable gameplay. It would have to have that solid South Park humor that initially drew an audience. And South Park 64 didn't really disappoint. For its time, I feel like South Park 64 really nailed the whole feel of playing through a South Park episode. You could pick through one of the 4 boys to start off with, although it didn't really matter that much because once you collected all your friends, you could just switch between whatever boy you wanted to choose from. Each character, even the smaller characters in cutscenes, were fully voiced, and the humor, like the show, did not hold any punches. It was rude and it was vulgar. Even the game's weapons fit the South Park universe pretty well, at least in regards to the humor. One of my favorite weapons to use, both in the single player and multiplayer, don't worry, we'll get into the multiplayer too later, was the Terrence and Phillip dolls. You could swap between Terrence and Phillip as each weapon had their own separate firing modes. Terrence doll would work like a regular timed grenade that, when triggered, would explode in a giant poison fart cloud, causing massive damage to anyone inside it. The Phillip doll would work as a proximity bomb and could cause a lot of frustration, especially in the game's more tight levels. Now, as I mentioned before, the game did have a multiplayer aspect. The entire campaign could be completed cooperatively, and it even included a pretty decent versus mode for up to 4 players, and you would compete in Deathmile style combat a la GoldenEye, and it even included an additional 15 characters unlocked via cheats that you would discover during the game's story. And just like single player, each multiplayer character was also fully voiced, and while they may have only included a small variety of lines, was still pretty impressive for its time. Now, it wasn't all sunshine and cheesy poofs when it comes to South Park 64. The game did have quite a few faults. For starters, the game's draw distance has to be the worst I have ever seen in anything. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Draw distance is basically how far your character can see in front of them. And in South Park 64's case, it was just really bad. Moving on, some of the maps too were just really big and tough to navigate through, and given the game's draw distance, it made the issue even more difficult. So much so that in the game's first level, which in my opinion is the biggest offender when it comes to this issue, the developers actually had to include these giant red arrow signs in the map in order to point you in the right direction so you wouldn't get lost. Another issue I had in the game that it was pretty repetitive. Kill larger waves of smaller pawn enemies and fight your way through the larger tank enemies. Rinse and repeat with other hostile South Park referencing enemies through 5 okay-ish type levels. I don't know if I can really blame Acclaim for what they've done with the aforementioned South Park games. They landed themselves an extremely lucrative license that had an ever-growing audience, and then quickly threw a bunch of crap at the wall to see what would stick, as quickly as they could in order to capitalize in case the South Park train were to suddenly derail. And in business sense, that seems pretty smart. But unfortunately for them, none of that crap stuck, and the majority of the South Park games they threw out, with the exception of South Park 64, were poorly received, both critically and with audiences, for good reason. It was very clear the games were rushed and very little care was put into them, so while they may have gotten those few South Park fans who just grabbed the game just because they saw South Park, including myself, I guess that's all they were really going for. So shame on you, Acclaim. Shame on you. Alright, viewer, that's going to do it for today. I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of Behind the Thing. If you liked what you saw, please click the corresponding button down below. If you'd like to see more content, please subscribe. And if you have a suggestion for future episodes, please leave it in the comments down below. And I hope you have a great day.
Goodbye.